Chapter 18, Americans Move West. Section 2, Wars in the West. Settlers encounter the Plains Indians. The Plains Indians that we're going to talk about include groups like the Sioux, the Pawnee, and the Cheyenne, and their main way of living was hunting buffalo. They used buffalo for everything. They used it for food, they used it for shelter, they used it for clothing, and they used the buffalo for utensils. Alright, so miners and settlers are also increasing in numbers into the Midwest Great Plains area. And as they did that, Indians were getting a little angry and some attacks might happen. So the federal government meets up with the Native Americans and they sign a treaty called the Treaty of Fort Laramie that recognized the Native American claims to the Great Plains. However, it did allow the United States to build forts in the Great Plains area and travel across Native American land safely. And the United States government will make lots of these treaties with the Native Americans. However, they will go back and renegotiate these treaties once gold was discovered in places like Colorado, which pushed Native Americans off their lands that were promised to them in the treaties that they signed, and moved to places like that are called reservations. These are areas of federal land set aside for them. Okay, so if we're looking at this map here, Fort Laramie is right here. It's in the state of Wyoming territory at that time, but anyway, Fort Laramie is right there. That's where the treaty was signed that recognized Native American claims. The movement of pioneers and miners across the Great Plains and through Native American hunting grounds led to many conflicts with the tribe, the Sioux. And the Sioux were led by a man named Crazy Horse, as you see in this picture here. Most Southern Plains Indians agreed to go to reservations under a treaty called the 1867 Treaty of Medicine Lodge, except for the Comanche, who will continue to fight until 1875, and also the Apache. When Native Americans resisted confinement on reservations, U.S. troops were sent and forced those tribes to go on to them. One example of this would be the Apache, who refused to move to the reservation. The Apache were led by a man named Geronimo, who you see pictured here. And he continues to fight with the Apache until 1886 when he finally gives up, surrenders. That is really the end of the wars in the West when Geronimo surrenders in 1886. As fighting on the Southern Plains came to an end, new troubles will begin in the North. And that's where you see Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer in 1876 is heading into the South Dakota area where gold was discovered, and the tribes there, like the Sioux, refused to leave, and so they put up a fight. On June 25th, 1876, Custer's scouts found a Sioux camp along a place called the Little Bighorn River, which is in the Montana Territory. Leading about 264 of his soldiers, Custer raced ahead without waiting for any supporting forces. In fact, Armstrong came with a larger force, but he decided to hold half of them back and decided only to take half his men into Little Bighorn, where thousands of Sioux were waiting for him. The Battle of Little Bighorn was the Sioux's last major victory, and they were led by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, and Custer was killed in this defeat, and so did 264 of his men. Which jumps us ahead a little bit to 1890, where U.S. troops kill about 150 Sioux in the massacre at Wounded Knee. The U.S. troops were going to go arrest Sitting Bull, who they thought was trying to start a new rebellion. And when they got onto the reservation, Sitting Bull was killed, and the tribe members of the Sioux ran, fearing for their lives, where they decided to surrender a few miles later on Wounded Knee. And as the U.S. troops were gathering up the weapons, various stories recount something different, but essentially we have a guy who had a gun tucked under his coat. He refused to give it up. It fell. Shot rang out. The U.S. troops fired into the crowd, killing 150 Sioux. In the southwestern part of the United States, more specifically Arizona and New Mexico, that's where the Navajo live. and the Navajo refused to move on to a reservation. So, U.S. troops will be sent down to move them there. And they raided and burned Navajo fields and homes and livestock. When the Navajo needed or were starting to get hungry and they needed shelter, they decided to surrender. And when they did surrender, they were forced to walk a 300-mile march to their reservation, which was called the Long Walk. And along the way, countless Indians died. In the far west, you have the Nez Perce, who are kind of in the Idaho-Oregon area, and the U.S. promised to let the Nez Perce keep their traditional lands. That is until the United States government wanted it. And so they went back on their promise. And so battles do break out. Now, Chief Joseph, who's in charge of the Nez Perce, he didn't want to fight. But an incident occurred where fighting did happen. And instead of standing and fighting for the land, they decided they're going to flee to Canada. So Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce start moving toward Canada, if you follow the map here. And they get really close. They were only maybe a half a day away from the border to Canada, where they were stopped by U.S. troops. And once they surrendered, they were forced to a reservation in Oklahoma. By the late 1880s, most Native American tribes were on reservations. There, you will see a movement start called the Ghost Dance Movement. Now, what the problem here is that most of these tribes who are forced on reservations are on reservations that are totally different than what their normal way of life is. For example, the Plains Indians who hunted buffalo now are on reservations where there's no buffalo. So a lot of depression is setting in. Indians were starving. And so a ghost dance movement begins. And this was a movement or a dance that helped. It's kind of a religious ceremony that predicted the arrival of paradise for Native Americans. But of course, U.S. officials on the reservations misunderstand this, and they see it as a rallying cry for a rebellion, because you have Indians running around in circles chanting. And so government officials are being sent to those reservations to put down this ghost dance movement. That's kind of why Sitting Bull was killed on his reservation, because they believe he's the one that started the ghost dance movement. Gradually, the ghost dance movement will die out after the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. Sarah Winnemucca, who is a Paiute Indian, lectured on problems of the reservation system and called for reforms in the 1870s. She gave lectures on all these problems, and eventually those problems will be listed in a book that was written by a woman named Helen Hunt Jackson in 1881. Some reformers believe that Native Americans should adopt the ways of white people. And so you see the Dawes General Allotment Act of 1887 passed. It made land ownership among Native Americans private. Now, we've talked about this before. Native Americans didn't believe in land ownership. They believed the land was open for everyone. However, by passing this act, they gave land to Native Americans. Now, the whole idea of the Dawes General Allotment Act is to lessen the traditional influences of Native American society and to encourage these Native Americans to adopt the ways of the white people. Now, like I said, these Native Americans didn't think they deserved land or should own land, so they ended up selling their land to other people. And the Dawes General Allotment Act ended up taking about 2/3 of Native American land. That is the end of Section 2.